Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Renata Nagatomi. I work at John Science Directorate of Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE. This webinar, entitled The Use of Mobile Phone Data for Official Statistics, Trending in Topics, invites distinguished speakers who will share their insights into this exciting field. This webinar is an initiative of United Nations Regional Hub for Big Data in Brazil, promoting the sharing of knowledge in Latin America and Caribbean. Our thanks to the support of the Economic Commission of Latin America and Caribbean. Without further ado, let's begin our first speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Letuzzi. He is the director of DataPop Alliance, an international NGO he co-founded in 2013 with MIT Media Lab and the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where he holds visiting academic appointments. He is also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. He works on the applications and implications of data, big data, statistics, digital technology, and AI for human development, humanitarian action, and democracy. He holds PA and MA for Sciences Po Paris and MA from Columbia University, where he has a Fulbright Scholar and a PhD from UC Berkeley. Dr. Emmanuel Letuzzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. All right, so I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, just taking the connection. You can hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. All right, so I'm gonna put my my screen in full mode. And here it goes. Okay, so well, thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. So well, obviously 20 minutes is a short time to discuss such a large, complex question. So yeah, I'll try to do my best to synthesize as much as possible and as clearly as possible. So I've titled the presentation to Potential Pitfalls and Prospects of Mobile Data and More for Official Statistics. So it's a topic on which I've worked for quite some time. So I'll share some screens of previous presentations and works. I won't go into details, and this is just for reference. Perhaps the slides will be shared with the attendees afterwards. So just some of the things, and of course we can connect on LinkedIn and exchange after the presentation. So some of the earlier work that I've done in this field are or include those 3 papers or works. So the Big Data for Development report that I wrote for UN Global Pulse about 11 years ago already, so on Big Data for Development. So you mentioned my PhD at Berkeley, so I actually focused my dissertation on the implications and application of cell phone data for demo economic research. And recently I was part of the so-called high-level expert group of Eurostat on the topic of sharing or using or reusing private data for official statistics. So in terms of, so I also do a bit of a political cartooning in my pastime and in a previous life. And so this is just a small drawing that I made actually at Eurostat about 4 years ago in Brussels, joking about the fact that Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, said about 15 years ago that statistician would be the sexiest job of the 21st century. And unfortunately, that hasn't really happened yet. It's more like, data scientist or AI engineer or, so the joke is that, well, you see these 3 gentlemen still wearing suits saying, well, he didn't specify when in the 21st century that would happen, that statistician would be the sexiest job of the century. And so I think with new generative AI, there is a renewed interest in the question of if and how private data can be used for official statistics. There are also new concerns and fears that maybe official statisticians will be wiped out or wiped off by AI, or there is a sense that it's a new moment in which that presents great opportunities for official statistics. And I think we are in this moment where there is both an opportunity and an obligation for official statistics to really get on the train. So these are more a few papers that I was part of over the years. As I said, I'm not going to go into the details. You can look them up. The point here is that this question of using official private data, especially cell phone data, so mobile operator data for official statistics, has been around for at least 10 years. We've made some progress, but the progress has been pretty slow. So recently, I gave a presentation at ITU in Brussels, and so you see here on the left-hand side the cover, and then on the right just the room. And so about the promises and perils of AI for statistics, just to emphasize the point that there is, I think, a renewed interest in the question. So if we take a step back, so it's been about 10 years that people have wondered, NSOs, but also governments, researchers, with the data revolution. So this emergence of this techno-social phenomenon, the rise of new kinds of data, new computing capacities, machine learning, deep learning, etc., then surely we would be able to better measure all sorts of phenomenon, like human phenomenon, and therefore it would help actually promote some goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So that was kind of like the hope 10 years ago. So if we fast forward, I mean, it's not all gloom and doom. We have to have a bit of a balanced assessment, but surely we can do better. I mean, there are lots of inequalities, climate change, populism is rising, and official statistical offices are still struggling financially and otherwise to make facts matter. So we are, I think, in this juncture where we can do better with the data and the technology that we have. So that's kind of like the framing. Something that's interesting is that, so another little doodling on the left-hand side, you see this gentleman saying, well, the good news is the data revolution is here. We can measure things much better than ever before, such as poverty. But the bad news is we can't do anything about it. So this is, just to stress what's called sometimes the decision gap, that even with the best information, the best data, we don't make the right decisions, or we don't make the decisions that the data should lead us to make. You can find that on the right-hand side, where actually cross-sectionally, there isn't a very, very strong relationship between the quality of statistics and the quality of outcome. And so you get into lots of discussion about, causation, reverse causation, endogeneity, etc. But I think it's still important to remember that we can have the best statistics that we want. At the end of the day, what matters is the outcome. So it's also a question for official statistic offices. I think they have to also look at, how is their products or statistics actually used to make better decisions, and what are the outcomes? So something that I think is important to remember is that when we talk about official statistics, we talk about two different things. One are data, so the products that come out of official statistical offices and systems. So that's one thing. But these are like certain types of data that have specific features. They abide by the fundamental principle of statistics, etc. We also talk about official statistics as an institute or institution, or as an industry. And so I think it's useful to keep in mind that we can talk about one or the other, one being the outcome or the other. And so I think the key question is whether as an industry official statistics can, in the age of AI, big data, of cell phone data, etc., can retain, regain, revive, or reinforce their key role for development and democracy. That's kind of like, the big prize that I think we have to keep in mind. It's not just about, oh, how can we access cell phone data? There has to be a larger vision, and I think the vision is this one, in a world where you have mis and disinformation, a lack of trust, distrust, disdain, polarization, and so on and so forth. That's a fundamentally political question. Now, in terms of the promise and the opportunities, so this webinar focuses, of course, on cell phone data. And so they're called usually CDRs, or cold detail records, or cold data records. Both are used. And so these CDRs, about 10 years ago, there have been some early examples of the fact that you could actually measure a number of things using those CDRs. And I'll give examples later on. I'll just show you what these are for those of you who are not familiar with with these types of data. So they are the digital records of how you use your cell phone, whom you called, where you are, etc. And so around 2013, 14, a bit earlier, there were actually papers saying, well, you can construct socio-demographic indicators with those so-called digital breadcrumbs. So it's actually quite appealing. The hope was that it was going to be cheaper, more granular, more timely, all sorts of benefits, which to this day are still the benefits that people have in mind when they say we should actually use and access those kinds of data. So if we take a look at exactly what those are, and likewise, you can spend more time looking at this slide. So it's basically, so you can look at the column, sorry, the table on the top. Basically, every time someone makes a phone call, you have the caller ID, you have the cell phone tower location where you call from, the tower location where the call is sent to, or SMS, the duration of the call. If it's an SMS, you have the size, the number of words, etc. And so it creates just a metadata about your call. And so if you multiply this by hundreds of millions of callers, many times a day, then you have very, very rich data set, very sensitive, of course, but very, very rich, which contains insights. And so these insights, so this is another little comic strip that I made 10 years ago for a British magazine to explain actually machine learning with cell phone data. Like, what's kind of like, the magic, how can you estimate poverty using cell phone data? Well, it's really basic machine learning where you have ground truth data. So you can have multi-dimensional poverty index, you can have income, you can have, and you let an algorithm find the best relationship between this very large table that I alluded to earlier of the digital signatures of the different cell phone activity and your ground truth. So that's the basic of this field. You have to find this or develop this kind of like machine learning models. And so these kinds of MNO data, so MNO data stands for mobile network operator. And so it's equivalent largely or exactly to CDRs, have been used in more recent months or years for a wide range of applications and domains. So for instance, in the field of demography, of course, and migration, because we have this in our pockets and basically it's like a tracker of our movement. And so there are a number of things you can do on the mobility front and measures like radius of gyration, origin destination matrices, so lots of things on the mobility side. And you can also study things that seem a bit farther away from cell phone data. You can actually study crime and crime patterns. So it's not Minority Report, not quite. It's the fact that you can build predictive models based, if you have ground truth data on criminality, you can look at how does it look like in cell phone data. Are there more crimes where there are more people, or are there more crimes when there are fewer people? And what are the types of social capital that you can measure from cell phone activity, bridging, bonding, and how does that correlate with crime? And we've done that so on the bottom left, in a number of Latin American and American cities. And we're doing this in other places. You can look at energy consumption, so Sustainable Development Goal 7. Of course, during COVID, there was a lot of interest in the field of public health. So contact tracing, and it's been used in Alicante, for instance, by the team of Nuria Oliver, who was the main author of this paper mentioned here on the bottom right. So this is a bit what's been done. One thing that I think is important is I think CDRs alone are not enough. So this is something I'm going to stress pretty strongly, that I think the new trend is actually merging, mixing, combining different data sources, both so-called traditional, so survey, which usually provide ground truth, but also Earth observation, financial transactions, pollution from captors and sensors. So there are lots of new data that are very rich, and in combination with CDRs and MNO data. So, for example, we're doing since the event is organized with IBGE. So I thought I would show this example of some work we're doing in two favelas in Rio and Sao Paulo about measuring poverty from Earth observation data, and we're hoping to be able to expand that to the use of cell phone data with a large Brazilian provider. I also think, just very quickly, that we should actually look at other other questions that are not, so it would be tier 2 indicators, or what used to be tier 3 indicators in the SDG agenda. So things like mental health. So there are lots of outcomes that are not very well measured that we could push the envelope with these new data. So, but we are stuck in this kind of pilot, MVP, proof of concept, and it hasn't scaled very much. So why hasn't it scaled very much? So what are the key challenges? And then I'll close on the some like considerations for the future. So the goal is to facilitate the systematic analysis of use of sensitive data, public or private such as MNO data, in privacy preserving and participatory ways at scale. That should be, I think, the goal. And so we have the technology, we have the data, we have lots of things, but there are still challenges. So the challenge is I chose to take this this paper on the left-hand side as an example, or as the basis for discussing these challenges in just 5 minutes or 4 minutes. So this is something that we wrote 4 years ago, maybe, with Nuria Oliver, whom I mentioned previously. And so it's called Sharing and Caring. This was a joint paper between Datapop Alliance and the Vodafone Institute for Society and Communications. And we try to explain the four sets of challenges and requirements so you can see them. So get the politics and culture right, get the tech and science right, get the governance and ethics right, and get the economics right. So you have kind of like a political cultural basket, a technology and scientific basket, a governance and ethics basket, and an economic financial one. So I want to start very quickly with the tech and science. Of course, it has to be done in privacy preserving ways. So you need architectures, you need systems, technological systems that ensure the privacy and the protection of the data that you use. So it's a must-have, and a lot of work has been done in this field. You also need to make sure that the data is representative. Often there is the argument, well, it's very large, but it's not representative. Not everyone has a cell phone. So there are ways to correct for sample bias. So that's let's say the tech and science basket. These challenges are paramount, but there are ways to address them to a large extent. Secondly, you have to get the governance and the ethics right. Often it was an afterthought, saying, well, as long as it's safe, then things are okay. Well, I think you need to have participatory mechanisms. You need to ask ethical questions. You need to have what's called human or society in the loop. So all sorts of things that are challenging to make the project more sustainable. You have to get the economics right also. The question of the right business model has been around for many years, and no one has really cracked it. So usually when people think about making those projects or pilots more sustainable, they think about a freemium model, where if you are the NSO, maybe you would have access to some of the data for free, and then if it's more granular, you pay a bit more. So that's definitely an avenue that's being explored. I don't think it's the only one. I think maybe there could be tax incentives given to companies to actually share and compute the data. This is a cost to them, but there are also, I would say, social good and public good arguments for state, so governments to really get into the mix and facilitate the development of these pilots and this industry. First and last, get the politics and the culture. So I have 3 minutes left. So the main point, the main argument is it has to be part of a cultural change. It's something that's quite sensitive. Everybody knows that. So it's not just between the NSO and the private company. I think academics, civil society organizations have to be also part of the mix. There has to be lots of awareness raising. There has to be lots of discussions. So it's really a cultural shift more than anything. And so the paper on the right-hand side, I think that I mentioned towards human AI is actually quite I think interesting, a good read in that in that vein. There are discussions about how to have democratic inputs into AI systems or algorithms that you would use to compute cell phone data and extract indicators for official statistics. There's always, when you deal with technology, there's always the the fear or the bias that, you know, it's only something for technologists. And so the cartoon on the left hand side, you know, pokes at that, makes fun of that. You know, trust me, I'm a doctor. Trust me, I'm a data scientist. I think people should be involved in these processes, and it's so, yeah. That's I think is key. Here it's just a great quote from Bruno Latour, a French philosopher, about the role of trust and culture. And the argument is just that, you know, facts are usually, in short, stats and facts are as good as the trust between people. If people do not trust the number of the fact, then we know what's happening. And so that is also something we have to keep in mind. It's not sufficient to just produce numbers. People have to trust them. So there needs to be also an element of trust building and maintaining between NSOs and the public. And so last, so I've shared already a lot of that. I just want to finish with an example of a project we've been working on for many years, which is called the Open Algorithms, or OPAL project. I have 90 seconds left, which I think reflects and tries to build on a lot of these, you know, principles and lessons of the past few years. So the OPAL vision, so I call it a poly innovation, because it's both a technological innovation, but also a governance or social innovation, because there is this idea of human or society in the loop through governance mechanisms. So it's a question and answer mechanism. It would be, so if the NSO is on the right-hand side, it would ask questions to private sector data, and it could be multi-source. And then it's only the indicator, so it can be, you know, poverty estimation, it can be a mobility matrix. Only that is shared, and in a privacy-preserving way. The data, the raw data, never leave the servers of the private company or the partner company, which can be public as well. And it's pseudonymized, it's aggregated, and you also have a governance system. So we are testing this, for instance, so different OPAL for humanitarian action and the SDGs in Senegal, for instance, with the Senegalese presidency, and on our roadmap. So this is my last slide, and so I will stop, I think, at 20 minutes sharp. On the roadmap, so we are trying to expand to not just MNO data, but also Earth observation data, financial transaction, and also macro data, which are very rich and very sensitive, and also other sorts of data, as I've mentioned, in a number of countries. Brazil is one of them. We would very much like to build on the pilot that I mentioned to develop such a system. And we're doing this in partnership with other organizations whose logo you can find here. So I'm at 20 minutes and 15 seconds. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for the enlightening talk. We will now move on our next set of speakers. For the joint presentation, Gary Lefever and Omar Fidel. Gary is the CEO, co-CEO and general counsel, and Omar Fidel is the chief of data sciences and head of privacy research. Ananos. Gary is leading expert on data risk management technologies and advise regulators around the globe on what is possible by using technology to meet and embrace regulatory requirements. Omar Fidel is a chief data scientist and head of privacy research at Ananos. Gary and Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We very much appreciate this opportunity. I'll be speaking first, and then Omar will finish. So great timing here, and thank you, Emmanuel, for the setup. We're here to talk about getting the tech and science right. So we refer to this as data stewardship, and this is part of a presentation that we gave to the UN Big Data Regional presentation, but we're specifically focusing on synthetic data. And this is about how you embed controls into data to get the desired outcomes. So I think, again, Emmanuel did a very good job of highlighting some of the worthwhile objectives, both with regard to democracy as well as development. But how do you do this in a way that people have trust in the data? So Ananos combines different techniques, and I'll highlight this very quickly. And as I said, Omar will then focus on synthetic data. But what's key here, this quote from S&P Market Intelligence, is our technology and the way we go about embedding trust into the data allows the use of the data and accelerated use of the data because the timeliness and fidelity of data is oftentimes very important. And we do that through a variety of different means so that the AI and machine learning and analytics can be completed. Here's why a system like ours is so important. This is a very confusing area. There's all kinds of words that are used and oftentimes used to mean different things. We created this graphic to depict that there's a continuum. There's unprotected clear text, source data, which is absolutely appropriate to use in certain circumstances. And then there's a host of different protections that can be applied. And our system actually allows the automatic enforcement of the different techniques that are on this chart so that the person actually processing the data does not themselves have to be an expert. Rather, an expert in the field has established the criteria and the parameters under which the data is processed. So what does this enable? It enables data to be compliant, not just with laws, but contracts and social mores by reducing the risk. Very importantly, it protects the data in a way that does not degrade the utility, timeliness, or fidelity. And it does it in a way that it's available at the speed of data, because that's what all this is about. So by embodying these capabilities into the data and having the subject matter experts set the parameters for the controls, then non-experts can implement them with absolute confidence, which then instills trust in the people whose data it pertains to. One of the biggest challenges is all the things on the right are things people want to do with data, but they all violate one of the fundamental principles of traditional data protection, which is process the data within a limited perimeter so you can exert control. And the reality is that's not how data flows, and that's not how data is processed anymore. So you have to be able to implement centralized control over decentralized data flows and processes. And that needs a focus on the outcomes. So the different techniques are important, but what's paramount is the outcome. And the two primary outcomes that we deliver are anonymization, and that could be done in a couple of ways, but the way we're focusing on today is synthetic data, and the controlled reversal of lawfully de-identified data, which is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but I will at least mention it. So here's how we look at this situation. There are a variety of data protection techniques, sometimes called privacy enhancing techniques. They're on the left-hand side. And this is what we call a knockout slide. Each of them has their own strengths and weaknesses. But when you look at them as to where you're trying to go with the data, you quickly realize that only a subset of these protect data when it's actually in use. And that's where access controls fall down. They protect the data up to access and use. Then you may want to have the data sharing in multiple clouds or multiple different data warehouses or data lakes. And the reality is that's where trusted execution environments fall down. It's a promising technique. It's a new one in the cloud, but it has limitations. And then if you want the data to be able to be processed at speed and scale that enterprises and organizations and countries require, some of these approaches like multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, they're just not viable. They take too much resources, they take too much time, they require you to change your standard operating procedures. And then when you want both high protection and high accuracy, many of the traditional approaches to de-identification fall short. And so that brings us to synthetic data, which is the focus of today's discussion. And synthetic data enables you to gain insights, but it prevents relinking to identity. And one point that we can touch upon at a later time, or if anyone's interested in following up directly, statutory pseudonymization is defined under numerous statutes, actually controls, but enables controlled relinking. So at Ananos, we took those techniques that we thought were the most appropriate, and we combined all of them into what we call variant twins. Our product is called Data Embassy. It's called that because with our technology, the data can flow anywhere around the globe and have the protections that someone's embassy could provide to them within any given country. And a variant twin is a use case specific variation of a digital twin So yes, personal data, but also trade secrets, state secrets, contractually restricted data. A digital twin is a digital depiction of a person, place, or thing. A variant twin is a protected use case specific output that enables you to use the data. You'll see when Omar goes through the demonstration, how this works is the data has already been set up so that pre-approved transformations that apply a variety of data science and data privacy controls can be applied so that any volume of data going through the system are consistently and scalably protected in the same manner. This is done again, as I said, by having a variety of different techniques. We will be focusing on synthetic data for this discussion, but it also enables data sanitization, data simulation, statutory pseudonymization, and an assessment of the risk for the data uses involved. What's critical is this toolbox approach to controls enables with one platform to take organizations and companies and countries everywhere through the full continuum here of data uses, from initial test, dev, and demo, up through sharing for enrichment, which goes very much in line with some of the objectives that I believe Emmanuel was talking about. So just very quickly, here's an example. At some point, there is a reluctance to provide sensitive source data to the major data repositories. Oftentimes, it's because consent simply cannot fully protect the individuals. There's increasing risk from internal misuse and external breaches. Breaches are proliferating around the globe. And it's the inability to protect data when it goes outside of perimeter. And if you can't get that sensitive data into those repositories, then you can't get it into the analytics platforms and the applications that you need to actually derive insights. And what Data Embassy does is it actually converts the source data into this protected output of a variant twin at the speed of data to deliver the data to the repositories necessary to deliver the insights. So I would just like to say that we do work with NTT in the region. If anyone's interested in learning more, you can also send an email to learnmore@nanos.com and indicate that you are a participant on this webinar. Omar?
Thank you, Gary. Let me share my screen and go through the second part, which will focus more on synthetic data. So the synthetic data, as Gary just mentioned, is one of several techniques. It fits very well certain use cases, and for other use cases, it has some limitations. So it is also important to know those and know when to combine it with other techniques. So today I will do in two parts. First, high-level introduction of synthetic data, and then go into an illustrative use case and a demo of synthetic census data with the NIST collaborative research cycle. So first, what do we mean when we say synthetic data? There are really two aspects that define synthetic data. The first one is that it is artificially generated. It is generated by algorithms. Synthetic data is not measurements of real events or real people. They are data that is generated by an automated process. The second aspect is that synthetic data is realistic. If synthetic data is completely unrealistic or random, it's not really useful. So when we talk here about synthetic data in the context of data analysis, we're really interested in realistic data. So in particular, in mobile data or mobility data or mobile phone data is part of this in the sense that it is structured. So there's a time series component, there's a geolocation component. This is really what we're talking about here, structured synthetic data. So it can go in complexity from simple single tables, or it can include those more sophisticated elements like time or geography. But two aspects that here will make synthetic data very interesting from a utility and privacy perspective. The first one is it looks and feels like real records. So when you look at this synthetic data set, the values look real, and the same here, you see the time series are fitting the real time series. So here you can see already that it has a look and feel of the real data. So you can use it in the same tools, the same pipelines for the similar use cases. The second aspect, and here we'll come to how synthetic data is generated, is that by construction, it does not have a one-to-one correspondence with records from the real data set. So there are three ways to generate synthetic data. One is pure simulation. We know the rules, we know what a particular system is evolving. For example, you know how many people live in a certain area, what's their probability of moving from one point A to one point B, and you just encode that in the process, and you use that to simulate the data. The second big family of generation process is automatic relationship learning. So we would use AI models, machine learning models, statistical models to learn implicit relationships within the data. And from there, from that distribution that we learn from the data, we generate and sample from that distribution new data points, new artificial data points. And then there's a third method which really would combine those two and gives the most granularity as to what you want your synthetic data to look like. So you can start by learning the relationships from the real data, and then you can tweak that or modify that or manipulate that to get a different data set than the real. There are some use cases that where this is a desirable property. If your data set, for example, is imbalanced and you want to overrepresent certain categories, this is a way to do that. So as I mentioned, I'm focusing here on the middle part, so learning the relationships from the data. This is a very simple data set that can be modeled just by a normal distribution that has two variables and the covariance, and modeling those give us the distribution of the data sets. Of course, the more attributes and the more dimensions we add to this data, the more complex this distribution will look like, and the more complex it will be to learn those implicit relationships. And we'll see some of that in the demo. Now, why would you use synthetic data? There are a number of use cases. One of them is around data collaboration, so sharing data across organizations when it comes to starting projects. So you want to start to work with a third-party provider, but they cannot get access to the real data because that is very sensitive. Synthetic data here would provide a very good alternative to get started, all the way to advanced analytics use cases. Now, one question that was mentioned here is, okay, synthetic data is used as anonymous data. How anonymous is synthetic data anonymous? Here, I'll just take a couple of minutes to mention a tool that we have developed. So this is an open source tool. The paper was published just a couple of weeks ago at the PET symposium in Lausanne. And basically, this is a tool that measures the three re-identification risks as defined by the Working Party 29, singling out, linkability, and inference. And it works by comparing the synthetic data to the original data and to a held out data set, and compare the success of different attacks. So this is an attack-based framework that gives us a quantified measure for the risk in remaining in the synthetic data. Of course, zero risk, we all know that that is not something that exists. So it is important to control, measure, and mitigate that risk. And this has been peer-reviewed, as I mentioned, it's open source, and we have also evaluated it with the CNIL, French DPA technical experts. So now I would like to go into an illustrative example using census data. So this is coming from the NIST collaborative research cycle. It uses a data set called the Diverse Communities Data Excerpts. And this was built based on American Communities survey. And the data set was specifically designed to measure specific artifacts in the synthetic data. So NIST is evaluating multiple ways to generate synthetic data, and we are participating in that project by submitting different data sets. So here I will show you how that looks like. But this is how the data basically looks like. It's demographics, Puma, this is public use microdata area, and there are information here that I will go into more into the details. So let me show you first a description. So as I mentioned, demographics, age, gender, marital status, and other information like income, education, industry, work, etc. And then of course, some statistical fields like the weights overall to reveal the sample. This is 24 columns, so something not that complicated, but not that simple either. And it was specifically designed in terms of content to contain specific communities and specific minority data as well, to see whether synthetic data preserves some of those informations. So I'll here switch to the Data Embassy platform and show how we can create a synthetic data from that data set. So I'll add a new data source up, right? Synthetic, synthesize, and then I will just upload a CSV that I have here ready up. And as you can see, we have here the different variables. We can choose what we do with that, but we can, there's a detection phase that shows all of the variables, what we can do with it. We can keep it, we can drop it, we can apply specific policies. But just for the sake of the demo, I will proceed right away to the synthesization. Now, the synthesization is a process that takes some time, so it's not immediate because we learn the underlying relationships in the data. So what I'll do is I'll skip directly to a synthesization that was already running. So here you can see the high level scores, privacy score and the utility score. And I will show you how the evaluation looks like when we go into the details. So this is a report that we generate after the synthesization to check both the utility and the privacy. So the utility is important to know how close is synthetic data to the real data. Obviously, if you want to analyze this data, you want to know if there are errors in that data, how close it is to the original data, and take that into account. So this helps do that. So here we have an aggregate utility score of 98%, and we can break down by type of evaluation. So the marginals, the pairwise, the query counts, and we can look at every field and see how is synthetic data and original data comparing. So this is for categorical variable, this is for some continuous variables, but also when we start adding variables and looking at conditional distributions, for example, here, a distribution by the age, we can see that the conditional distribution is also preserved. Similarly, we can look at the pairwise dependencies. So here, looking at the relationship between two pairs of variables, and this is showing the correlation ratios. So we can see here that the coefficients are not exactly the same, but they're extremely close. So here 0.58, here 0.56, 0.76, here 0.75. So you can see that you can use synthetic data for these types of workloads. As I mentioned, there are privacy considerations with the anonymity, like the linkage, linkability, the inference attacks, and the singling out, but I will not go into much details in today's presentation. I just wanted first to look at some of the more advanced evaluations that are here in the NIST report. So this report is coming from NIST. And what's interesting here is we look at the relationship between income and education for different parts of the population. So first we start by looking at the total population and do a regression here. So in red, this is the real data, and in green, the de-identified data. And what's more interesting is once we start isolating specific groups. So we can look at white men, for example, and here we're going from 23,000 records to 6,400 records. So here we can see that the regression is still matching very well. Actually, the slopes are exactly the same. There's a difference in the intercept. But what's more interesting is if we start going to more minorities, so groups that are less represented in the sample that we took, and we see whether in synthetic data the results are still the same. So for example, here looking at Black women, we have 3,000 out of the 23,000, and we can see again that the synthetic data is still preserving this relationship between income and education, and that's actually remaining true even though we narrowed down to the point of a few hundreds of records. For example, here we're looking at American Indians, Alaskan Natives, or Native Hawaiians women, only 400 records, still looking at a slope that's pretty high fidelity compared to the real data. And what this tells us is we can actually use synthetic data for this type of workloads. So this is, of course, something that's quite interesting, because then we can be sharing some data that is much less sensitive, but at the same time preserves the utility of the information that we want to use. And I think I will stop here, and of course, if anybody has any questions or follow-ups, we're happy to discuss further. This specific project, again, is NIST Collaborative Research Cycle. They're doing an amazing work in researching the different algorithms and the different artifacts and what's happening there. And yeah, I took it as an example given the relevance for the Census Statistics Bureau present. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary and Omar, for your presentation. It's evident that data privacy and security are crucial aspects of modern usage. The reflection of Emmanuel leads us to realize that data revolution needs to fulfill its promises and seize the opportunity of EA and big data to strengthen official statistics, combating political risks and misinformation. Gary and Omar presented innovative technologies, including pseudonymizations and synthetic data to overcome data protection challenges and achieve desired outcomes without compromising the privacy and security with artificial intelligence, machine learning, analytics, and projects. Now we have some time for questions and answer session. Please feel free to ask questions to any of our speakers. We encourage open and interactive discussions. Raise your hand if you want to open your microphone. Any of you would like? Elio?
It looks like we have a question. A question for Omar. How do you combine AI and simulation approaches in the context of mobile data? How do you deal with the noise?
So the context of mobile data is extremely interesting, and the reason there is the high dimensionality of the data. Emmanuel has shown, one of the researchers who has used mobile data to re-identify and to show that with only 4 points you can re-identify with very high certainty the specific identity of the person if you're not using the right tools. Here, synthetic data for mobility data, in most cases that we work with, we look at first at what the use case is. So basically, what is the information we are trying to preserve in that data? But by experience, it is usually challenging to preserve all foreseeable and unforeseeable aspects in that data set. But once you know exactly what you want to preserve, which is, again, sometimes that is not the situation, right? But when that is the situation, the problem gets simpler, and we can synthesize that in a useful manner.
So Omar, what I hear you saying is, rather than trying to have both AI and simulation that would address all issues, once someone specifies what the business outcomes and analysis points are, then you could create a synthetic data set that simulates the real data that would be responsive for those points of interest.
Exactly.
Any other questions? Let's not be ashamed. If there is no more other questions, I'd like to thank you all for the question, for the esteemed speakers of sharing their expertise today. Any others? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I want to extend my gratitude for all the participants and the organizing team for making this webinar an event of success. We look forward to the future gatherings and continued exploration of the mobile data for statistics. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.